On August 3, 1952, in Live Oak, Florida, a well-dressed black woman walked into a doctor's office carrying a handgun. The waiting room was full of patients. The woman walked past them all, straight into the doctor's private office. Moments later, gunshots rang out. 4 shots, then silence. When people rushed into the office, they found Dr. Clifford Leroy Adams slumped in his chair, dead. And standing over him was Ruby McCollum, a 42-year-old mother of 3, one of the wealthiest black women in the county. Ruby didn't run. She didn't try to hide what she'd done. She simply waited for the police to arrive and arrest her. The murder of Dr. Adams shocked the small town of Live Oak. He was white, prominent, wealthy, and about to be elected to the Florida State Senate. Ruby was black, and despite her wealth, she lived in the segregated South where black people had virtually no rights. What happened next would expose a secret that white Live Oak desperately wanted to keep buried. A secret about power, abuse, and the violence that the Jim Crow South inflicted on black women. This is the story of Ruby McCollum, a woman who killed her abuser, a woman who was silenced in her own trial, and a case that has been deliberately forgotten for over 70 years. Live Oak, Florida in 1952 was a typical Southern town. Segregation was the law. Black people and white people lived in completely separate worlds. Ruby McCollum lived in the black section of town, but her life was far from typical for a black woman in the 1950s South. Ruby had been born Ruby Jackson in 1909. She grew up poor, but she was smart and determined. She married Sam McCollum, a man who ran what many people believed was an illegal gambling operation. Sam made a lot of money, and Ruby helped to manage it. By the early 1950s, the McCollums were wealthy by any standard. They owned property. They had a nice home. They employed people. Ruby dressed in expensive clothes and drove a nice car. But wealth didn't protect black people in Jim Crow, Florida. No matter how much money Ruby had, she still had to use separate bathrooms, eat in separate restaurants, and stay in separate hotels. She still had to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to white people who had far less money than she did. Dr. Clifford Leroy Adams lived in a very different world. He was one of the most respected white men in Live Oak. He was a doctor with a thriving practice. He was married with children. He was active in local politics and had just won the Democratic primary for state senate, which in 1950s Florida meant he had essentially won the election. Dr. Adams treated both white and black patients. In the segregated South, this wasn't unusual. Black people often had no choice but to see white doctors, even though they had to use separate entrances and wait in separate waiting rooms. Ruby McCollum became one of Dr. Adams' patients. That's how their relationship started, or at least that's what people in town believed. But the reality was far more sinister. Dr. Adams had been forcing Ruby into a sexual relationship. 4 years, he had been abusing her, using his position of power and the protection that his whiteness gave him in the Jim Crow South. Ruby couldn't say no. She couldn't report him. She couldn't tell anyone. In 1952, Ruby was pregnant with her 4th child, and everyone in the black community knew something that white Live Oak refused to acknowledge. The baby Ruby was carrying wasn't her husband's. It was Dr. Adams' child. This wasn't the first time. Ruby had given birth to another child years earlier who was also Dr. Adams' child, a little girl who didn't look like Sam McCollum at all. Sam knew what was happening to his wife. But what could he do? In 1950s Florida, a black man who accused a prominent white doctor of raping his wife would likely end up dead. So Sam stayed silent, and Ruby endured. But by August 1952, something had changed. Ruby had reached a breaking point. According to what Ruby would later try to tell in court, Dr. Adams had been demanding money from her. Large sums. He was also insisting that she continue their relationship, even though she was trying to end it. He had become threatening. On August 3rd, Ruby went to Dr. Adams' office. She brought a gun, and she made a decision that would change her life forever. When Ruby shot Dr. Adams 4 times in his office that morning, she killed one of the most powerful men in Suwannee County. The reaction from white Live Oak was immediate and furious. A black woman had killed a white doctor. In the eyes of many white residents, this was the ultimate crime, an unforgivable violation of the racial order. Ruby was arrested and taken to jail. Crowds of angry white people gathered outside. There was talk of lynching. The sheriff had to bring in extra guards to protect Ruby from the mob. The white newspapers described Dr. Adams as a beloved community leader cut down in his prime. They portrayed Ruby as a crazed, murderous black woman. The narrative was clear: this was a simple case of murder, and Ruby deserved the death penalty. But people in the black community knew there was more to the story. They knew about Dr. Adams and Ruby. They knew about the children. They knew about the abuse. Ruby's husband, Sam, hired lawyers to defend her. The trial was set for October 1952, just 2 months after the murder. Ruby's legal team wanted to present a defense based on the truth, that Dr. Adams had been abusing Ruby for years, that he had fathered her children, that she had killed him in self-defense after he threatened her. But there was a problem, a massive problem. The judge presiding over the case was Hal W. Adams. No relation to the victim, but deeply sympathetic to maintaining the racial status quo in Florida. Judge Adams made a series of rulings that would ensure Ruby never got to tell her story. He ruled that Ruby could not testify about her relationship with Dr. Adams. He ruled that evidence of Dr. Adams fathering Ruby's children was inadmissible. He ruled that any mention of sexual abuse or coercion was irrelevant to the case. Essentially, Judge Adams ruled that the only question the jury could consider was, did Ruby McCollum shoot Dr. Clifford Adams? Everything else, all the context, all the reasons why, were forbidden. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed every day. The jury was all white men, as was standard in Florida at the time. Black people were not allowed to serve on juries. Ruby sat silently through most of the trial. Her lawyers tried repeatedly to ask her questions about her relationship with Dr. Adams, and every time, the judge shut them down. At one point, Ruby tried to speak up on her own. She stood and tried to tell the jury what had really happened. Judge Adams immediately silenced her and threatened to have her removed from the courtroom. The prosecution's case was simple. Ruby McCollum walked into Dr. Adams' office and shot him 4 times. That was murder. The defense wasn't allowed to present any evidence about why she did it. The all-white jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Ruby McCollum guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Adams sentenced her to death in the electric chair. Ruby would become the first black woman sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair, and she had never been allowed to tell her side of the story. The Ruby McCollum case might have ended there. She might have been executed, forgotten, just another black woman destroyed by the Jim Crow South. But one person refused to let that happen. Zora Neale Hurston was already famous by 1952. She was a novelist, anthropologist, and one of the most important figures of the Harlem Renaissance. She had written Their Eyes Were Watching God and other celebrated works. But by the early 1950s, Zora was struggling financially and living in Florida. When she heard about the Ruby McCollum case, she was outraged. She knew immediately that this was a story that needed to be told. Zora convinced a black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, to hire her as a correspondent to cover Ruby's case. She attended the trial. She talked to people in Live Oak's black community. She investigated Dr. Adams' background. What Zora uncovered was explosive. Dr. Adams had a reputation in the black community for abusing black women patients. Ruby wasn't his only victim. There were other women who had been coerced into sexual relationships with him, other children who bore his features, but no one could speak openly about it. The white power structure in Live Oak had protected Dr. Adams while he was alive, and they were determined to protect his reputation after his death. Zora wrote articles for the Pittsburgh Courier detailing what she had learned. She wrote about the trial being a sham. She wrote about Judge Adams silencing Ruby. She wrote about the sexual violence that black women endured in the South with no legal recourse. Her articles caused a sensation in black newspapers across the country. But white newspapers in Florida either ignored the story or attacked Zora, calling her a troublemaker trying to stir up racial tensions. Meanwhile, Ruby sat in prison, awaiting execution. But then something unexpected happened. Ruby's lawyers appealed her conviction, arguing that Judge Adams' rulings had denied her a fair trial. In 1954, the Florida Supreme Court agreed. They overturned Ruby's conviction and ordered a new trial. Ruby would get another chance. This time, maybe she would be allowed to tell the truth. But that's not what happened. The state of Florida didn't want a new trial. They didn't want Ruby testifying about Dr. Adams. They didn't want the truth coming out in open court. So they did something calculated. They had Ruby examined by psychiatrists. The doctors declared her insane. And in 1956, Ruby McCollum was committed to the Florida State Hospital, a mental institution. Ruby would spend the next 20 years in that hospital. Not because she was actually insane, but because it was the easiest way to silence her. She was never retried. She was never executed. She was simply locked away and forgotten. Ruby McCollum spent 2 decades in the Florida State Hospital. During that time, the civil rights movement transformed America. The Supreme Court ruled segregation unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed. The world that had sentenced Ruby to silence began to crumble. In 1974, Ruby was finally released from the hospital. She was 65 years old. She had lost 22 years of her life, first in prison, then in a mental institution. Ruby returned to Live Oak briefly, but the town held too many painful memories. She eventually moved away and lived quietly until her death in 1992. She rarely spoke publicly about what had happened to her. The trauma, the silencing, the decades of confinement had taken their toll. Ruby had been forced to carry her story in silence for so long that even when she was finally free to speak, she chose not to. Zora Neale Hurston continued to write about Ruby's case for years. She tried to get a book published about the trial, but no publisher would touch it. The story was too controversial, too dangerous.
Was a native of the
Zora
state
died in
and
1960,
was very familiar with
poor
the
and
circumstances.
largely forgotten, though her literary reputation would be restored in later decades. The book she had written about Ruby McCollum was finally published in 1956, but it was heavily edited and sanitized. The full and censored story remained untold. Today, most people have never heard of Ruby McCollum. Her case isn't taught in schools. There's no monument to her. No major films or documentaries have told her story. Ruby has been deliberately erased from history because her story is too uncomfortable. It exposes too much about the reality of the Jim Crow South, about the sexual violence that Black women endured, about the complicity of the legal system in that violence. Dr. Clifford Adams is still remembered in Live Oak as a respected doctor and civic leader. His role as a sexual predator who abused Black women has been buried along with him. Ruby McCollum killed a man who had been abusing her for years. She killed him after he threatened her and continued to demand control over her body and her life. In a just system, that would be self-defense. But Ruby lived in a system designed to deny her justice. A system where a Black woman's word meant nothing. Where a white man's reputation was more important than a Black woman's life. Ruby tried to speak her truth in that courtroom in 1952. And she was silenced, not just by one judge, but by an entire society that refused to acknowledge what had been done to her. Ruby McCollum lived to be 83 years old. She outlived everyone who had condemned her, everyone who had silenced her. But she never got justice. Her story is a reminder that the horrors of Jim Crow weren't just about separate water fountains and back-of-the-bus seating. It was about power. It was about white men having unlimited access to Black women's bodies with no consequences. It was about a legal system that protected abusers and punished their victims. Ruby McCollum shot Dr. Clifford Adams because she had no other way out. And then she was punished twice, once by the legal system that convicted her without allowing her to defend herself, and again by history, which has chosen to forget her. But her story deserves to be remembered, because Ruby's silence was forced. Ours doesn't have to be. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.